Good morning and welcome to our new read aloud. It's kind of spooky because it's dark out, it's late. I got my computer on, so I feel like I'm kind of a ghost. But here's the book I'm trying. I've never read one of these, and the kids really like these. So if you've read it already, it's all right. Listen, because I'm kind of excited to read one of these finally. It's an I Survived book, and it's I Survived Mount St. Helens. And if you remember, we talked about this when we did our at the beginning of the year, our reading with the nonfiction. We talked about Pompeii. That was one of them. Well, Mount St. Helens was an eruption in Washington, and I actually have some volcanic ash from that because my dad, we lived in North Dakota, and he worked for the railroad. And so when a train came in, there was like a foot of volcanic ash on it, and he got some. It looks pretty cool. So anyways, I survived the eruption of Mount St. Helens. Sunday, May 18th, 1980, 8:32 a.m., Mount St. Helens, Washington State. For more than 100 years, Mount St. Helens had been a quiet, beautiful mountain surrounded by forests. Hikers climbed its winding trails. Skiers raced down its snowy slopes. Children splashed in its crystal-clear lakes. Except this peaceful mountain was not a mountain. It was a dangerous volcano, a deadly cone filled with molten rock and poisonous gases. And soon it would explode with the power of 10 million tons of dynamite. In the minutes before the eruption, 11-year-old Jessie Marlowe and her best friends Eddie and Sam were in a forest near Mount St. Helens. The day was warm and bright, the sky brilliant blue. St. Helens rose up over them, its perfect triangular peak sparkling with snow. And then, kaboom! Suddenly, Jess was in the middle of the deadliest volcanic eruption in American history. She watched in horror as the sky turned pitch black. A blizzard of ash poured down, swirling up her nose and making it almost impossible to breathe. Hot rocks pelted her like bullets shooting down from the sky. Then, whoosh, a blast of wind exploded out of the mountain, a white-hot mix of ash and gas and shards of rock. It raced down the mountain at jet speeds, burning everything in its path. The heat hit Jess and the boys, knocking them down. Jess felt as though she would burst into flames. Every breath was like inhaling fire. But the terror was just beginning. The eruption had shattered the mountain, and now a 50-mile-wide avalanche of rock and mud and melted ice was taking aim at the valley below. It grew larger by the second. It snatched up trees and boulders. It tore away bridges and swept away houses. It would destroy everything and everyone in its path. That's a pretty good opening chapter. Chapter 2. Flashback. 8 weeks earlier, Sunday, March 23, 1980, Spirit Lake Memorial Highway, Washington State. Skeleton Woman is not real, Jess said. She's totally made up, Sam agreed. Can we please stop talking about Skeleton Woman, said Eddie, Sam's twin brother. You're giving me the creeps. It was Sunday morning, and Jess and the Rowan twins were riding in the back of a red Ford pickup truck. Mr. Rowan, the twins' dad, was up front, singing loudly along to his favorite disco song. They were about 20 miles from their hometown of Cedar, Washington, rumbling along a winding highway. The road was lined with trees and a forever stretch of forest and rolling hills. They were heading to the Rowans' fishing cabin, which was on Loomis Lake up closer to Mount St. Helens. It wasn't fishing season quite yet, but Mr. Rowan wanted to get the cabin ready. He was happy to have Jess and the twins tagging along for the day. Looking across at the twins, Jess saw 2 matching buzz-cut heads, 4 identical green eyes, and about 10,000 freckles. When they were little, Jess would have done anything to look more like them. She had blown out her birthday candles with a wish for green eyes instead of brown. She even drawn magic marker freckles onto her pale skin. But Jess had outgrown that. And anyway, the twins weren't so exactly alike. Eddie was quiet and serious. Sam never shut up, and he had a fearless streak that sometimes got all 3 of them in big trouble. Like today, for example. Mr. Rowan didn't know the real reason that Jess and the boys wanted to get up to the mountain. Skeleton Woman. She was an evil woman from a scary old story, kind of like the witch from Hansel and Gretel, but worse, because she supposedly lived around here. She had wild white hair and coal black eyes and rusted metal claws instead of fingers. According to the old legend, she lurked in the dark forest that covered the slopes of St. Helens, the mountain that rose up over this whole valley. She wandered through the woods, searching for children whose bones she would use to make magic powders. It was just a creepy story, the kind you told while you were roasting marshmallows or huddled together at a slumber party. But some of the kids in their school actually believed Skeleton Woman was real. One girl, Missy Samuels, swore Skeleton Woman lived in a broken-down shack in the woods near Loomis Lake. "That whole part of the forest is cursed," Missy had said, flicking one of her curls. It had been last Wednesday, and they were on the blacktop at school. Eddie had been impatiently bouncing a red rubber ball. Usually they played kickball at recess, but Missy wouldn't stop yakking about the Skeleton Woman. Jess used to be good pals with Missy, but that was about 1,000,000 years ago, before Missy's dad got an important new job at the lumber company. Now Missy lived in the biggest house in Cedar, the only big house in Cedar. "Skeleton Woman is in those woods," Missy went on. "My dad says some of his workers saw her, and now they refuse to step foot in that part of the forest." "That's not true," Jess said. "They saw her, Jess," Missy insisted. "Her clothes were covered with blood." "It's just a dumb story," Eddie scoffed. "If you're so sure, maybe you should go to the shack yourselves," Missy said. This was starting to sound like a dare. "Fine," Sam blurted out. "We'll go." Jess and Eddie had shared a look that meant, please tape Sam's mouth shut now. But it was too late. "Fine," Missy said. "You better bring a camera because I'll need proof." Within minutes, she blabbed to everyone, making it sound like a big joke, with Jess and the twins as the punchline. So, of course, they couldn't back out, which is why they were here on this cold morning, sitting in the back of the red pickup. "But what if she's actually there?" Eddie asked. "Then Jess'll take her picture," Sam said. Jess grabbed her backpack where she had put Dad's camera. She felt a pang of guilt. The camera had been Dad's prized possession, and Jess knew that Mom wouldn't want Jess taking it into the woods. But Jess would be extra careful. She even wrapped it in a plastic bag in case it rained. "How will I take her picture?" Jess asked. "Mrs. Skeleton Woman," Sam said in a high voice. "Say cheese." Eddie leaned forward and bared his teeth like a skeleton. "Cheese," he growled. A glob of egg glistened on one of his teeth. They all burst out laughing, and Jess's honking giggle mixed with the twins' loud snorts. It took them all a few minutes to calm down. Eddie's face got serious again. "You guys aren't scared, are you?" he asked. "Nah," Sam said. "No way," Jess lied. Of course, they were scared. Who knew what they would find in that shack? Even if they didn't find Skeleton Woman and her bones, there could be a bear or 1,000 rats. Jess shuddered. But fear was better than other feelings, wasn't it? Like missing her dad, who died in a car accident 2 years ago? Or worrying about Mom, who seemed so lonely and worked way too hard. Those sad thoughts were always flickering at the edges of Jess's mind. So it was good to have other things to think about, like an evil old witch with smoldering black eyes. This is good so far, I like it. Chapter 3. They pulled into the parking lot at the lake, and Mr. Rowan came around to open the tailgate. "Hello, troops," he boomed. With his big belly, bushy beard, and laughing eyes, Mr. Rowan had always reminded Jess of a younger version of Santa Claus. Mrs. Rowan was half his size and about twice as strict. They all loved her, of course. Mrs. Rowan was Jess's mom's best friend. But today the boys didn't seem too upset that their no-nonsense mom wasn't here to keep them in line. Mrs. Rowan was away for the week. She was taking care of the twins' grandma, who lived about 50 miles away from Cedar. There were only 2 other cars in the parking lot today, a beat-up Toyota and a white pickup. There was an older woman standing by the truck. Even from a distance, they could see her long gray braid and bright smile. "Hello," she called out with a wave. "What a day!" "You said it," Mr. Rowan exclaimed. It was usually pouring rain around here in late March, but this morning the sky was bright blue and the sun shined down. "And just look at our pretty mountain," Mr. Rowan said, putting an arm around each of the boys and smiling up at St. Helens. The mountain's lower slopes were blanketed with green trees. The top was covered with snow. Its perfect triangle's peak sparkled in the sun. Jess always felt a flash of pride when she looked at Mount St. Helens. No, it wasn't as famous as Mount Hood across the border in Oregon, and it wasn't as tall as Mount Rainier, which loomed over Seattle, about 200 miles north of Cedar. But folks who lived here knew St. Helens was the most beautiful mountain in the Cascade Range. And if most people had never heard of it, who cared? Mr. Rowan gathered his supplies and headed to the fishing cabin. "I'll be organizing my gear," he called. "Don't go far, and Jess, keep those boys out of trouble." "Will do," promised Jess. Jess and the twins watched him disappear down the little path that led to the cabin. "This is going to be fun," Sam said, rubbing his hands together. "Fun?" Eddie said. "Let's face it," Jess said. "We have nothing better to do." And the twins nodded. Cedar wasn't a terrible place, but it sure was dull. Only about 400 people lived there. The closest grocery store was 20 miles away. Last weekend, the big excitement was the elk that wandered onto Main Street and blocked traffic for an hour. But Jess and the twins had their mountain and their forests, and they had each other. Eddie held out his hand, palm up. Jess and Sam laid theirs on top of his. It was a three-way secret handshake they had made up back in kindergarten. "All for one," Sam said. "And one for all," Jess and Eddie chorused. Dad had taught them that saying a long time ago. It was from The Three Musketeers, which was a book way before it became the name of a candy bar. The book was about three best friends who'd do anything for each other. There's the secret handshake. Like Jess and the twins, they would do anything. Well, it was about three best friends who would do anything for each other, like Jess and the twins. They linked arms and started marching toward the dark woods. "Watch out, skeleton woman!" Sam screamed. "We're coming to get you!" All right, Chapter 4. Missy had said the shack was about a half a mile up the winding trail above the lake. They figured it would take about 30 minutes to get there. The twins walked slightly ahead. Right away, they started bickering about who was the best pitcher on the Seattle Mariners. The baseball team was only 3 years old, and it wasn't very good, but the boys had become instant fans. Their dream was to see a home game in person, but they'd never been to Seattle. Neither had Jess. Missy had gone there last month for her birthday. She had come back bragging about eating a fancy steak restaurant, at a fancy steak restaurant, and of course seeing a Mariners game. The twins hated hearing about that. Soon, they crossed over to the best part of the forest, with old trees that soared up so high it seemed they were touching the sky. Jess breathed in the spicy smell of pines. Her ponytail swung in the chilly breeze. Her mind drifted and the twins' bickering voices faded. She walked with light steps, whispering the names of every tree and flower, careful not to trample any saplings or mushrooms as she stepped. It was how Dad had taught her to be in the forest. He'd loved it here so much. He and Mom and Jess had come up here whenever they could sneak away from the little diner they owned in Cedar. They'd camp under the trees and hike the trails. Dad would stop every minute to photograph Mom or Jess or some bird perched on a branch. He'd saved up for 2 years to buy his camera, and his dream had been for one of the photographs to be shown at a gallery in Seattle. No, he had never taken a photography class. He had never worked anyplace other than their diner. But you never knew. "Anything's possible," Dad always said. And the way he looked at Jess, his eyes bright with hope, she didn't doubt it. Maybe he had gotten his optimism from his granddad, Clive Marlowe. Clive had come here to southern Washington State when he was just 16 to work as a lumberjack. Back then, there was no highways or restaurants or towns in the Cascades. There were still wolves in the woods and grizzly bears that stood 10 feet tall. But mainly, there were trees, some of the most spectacular trees on Earth. The oldest ones had been here before George Washington was born, before the Mayflower sailed, when the only people here were Native Americans quietly hunting and fishing among the trees. But all that changed in the 1800s when American settlers came. They chased away most of the native people. Lumber companies bought up the forest. They sent men like Clive to cut down the trees. Soon enough, most of those century-old trees had been chopped into wood to build ships and railroads and buildings for America's brand new cities. Lumberjacking was dangerous. The biggest trees weighed 50 tons, as much as a train car. They came crashing down with so much force that the earth shook a mile away. Men were crushed by falling branches. They lost feet and hands to the blades of axes. Clive himself was almost blinded by a spray of razor-sharp wood chips. But it wasn't danger that got to Clive. It was watching those big trees disappear. He grew to hate the grinding sound of saws and axes. He dreaded the moment when a tree started to fall over, how its wood would moan and creak as though it was crying out in agony. So he quit work at the lumber company and opened a diner and he named Clive's. Folks were sure the diner would fail, but Clive didn't listen. So there's Clive. He's shown his emotion as the tree fell. That must be hard to do something that you hated to do, but it takes a lot of courage to leave, start over. And 50 years later, Clive's Diner was still there, passed down through the proud Marlowe family like a priceless treasure. Dad had taken it over after his own dad passed, and he and Mom ran it together until his dad's car accident 2 years ago. After Dad died, Mom wasn't so sure she wanted to stay in Cedar. She'd always dreamed of becoming a teacher, of living in a city like Seattle. But how could she close the diner that had been in Dad's family for generations? And how could they leave Cedar, where every crack in the sidewalk reminded them of Dad? Sometimes it felt like Mom and Jess were as rooted there as the old trees. Thinking about all of this made Jess feel dizzy, as if she were teetering at the edge of a cliff. But then Sam's voice jolted her back. "There it is!" he cried. Jess looked ahead. It was the shack. It sat there in the distance as though it had been waiting for them. All right, we're going to stop. That's a good place to stop. Have a good day. Oh, there's going to be no more discussion question. We might talk about it, and there might be something that we do with it during our reading, or if I might have you do a project on the read aloud. So make sure you just do the read aloud and enjoy it.